Hi everybody, this is Jay Goodrich, and today we're going to talk about exposure blending in Adobe Photoshop CS6. I typically blend exposures in Photoshop when two separate occasions occur in the field in which I cannot use my graduated neutral density filters. The first one is when I'm using a fisheye lens. The front element of the fisheye lens is curved to such a degree that if I used a graduated neutral density filter, you would see the edges of the filter and it wouldn't be that effective. The other is when the subject of my composition rises above the horizon line in my photograph. And as you can see here in the example we're going to go through today, if I were to put a graduated neutral density filter over this left-hand image here to darken out my sky and get that properly exposed, I would get the proper exposure on my sky, but in fact my tree trunk would turn into a silhouette and lose all of its detail. The drama in this shot is partially created because of the detail highlighted in the trunk of the pinion, and then also highlighted by the drama of the clouds in the sky. So by creating two separate exposures, I will allow my viewer to encounter both of those situations in my final composition. So what I do in the field is create an exposure that's balanced for my foreground and the trunk of the pinion here, and then I take a second exposure that is balanced for what's going on in the sky, and you can see the drama of the clouds in the background of the second image here on the right. We have these two separate images, and I have done some minor adjustments in the develop module here in Lightroom prior to exporting these images out to Photoshop, but the main part of this exercise today is going to be getting this foreground image to show through on this secondary dark sky image. So in my library module, I hit the G key for grid. You can see I have the two images highlighted, and if I go up here to photo, scroll down to edit in, I can click open as layers in Photoshop, and that will export these two images into a single document in Photoshop. Or a shortcut that I like to use is just to right click on one of the highlighted images and I get that same dialog option, which is edit in, open as layers in Photoshop. So I do that, and Lightroom sends the images to Photoshop as a single document and creates two separate layers of both of those images. You can see in this new document they just created, I have the dark image on top and the light image on the bottom. If I turn off this upper layer of the dark image, you can see that the lighter image is down below. And this is the setup that I like to have for using an exposure blending technique here in Photoshop. If for some reason Photoshop and Lightroom don't really talk well together and it loads my dark image on the bottom, all I have to do is click on that lower layer and drag it to the position in which I want, just like that. The way I'm going to blend these two images together is to create a layer mask on this darker upper layer. In order to do this, I need to create a selection, which will then in turn allow me to create a layer mask. Okay, so we have a lot of options available to us to create selections, which we can then turn into layer masks here in Adobe Photoshop. As of version CS5, they introduced a tool called the Quick Selection tool. It's available from shortcut letter W. It resides in the same palette as the Magic Wand tool. So if you're familiar with the Magic Wand tool, you'll know exactly where to go to grab this tool. The tool has a bunch of options available to us once we click it. We have the symbol for the tool itself. We have the tool with a plus symbol and the tool with a minus symbol. The plus symbol is the default after you start making your selection with this tool, so I leave that plus symbol selected, and what the plus sign does for us is it allows us to quickly add to our selection without starting a selection over from scratch. The minus tool correspondingly subtracts from our selection and allows us to remove pieces and parts that aren't selected properly. We have what looks like a brush icon up here as well, and it in fact does control this tool very similar to a brush. We can control the size, the hardness, spacing, angle, roundness, even the pen pressure if we're using a stylus to make our selections. And I leave the hardness to 100% because I'm going to use this tool to make a hard edge selection. I don't want to feather my selection from the beginning. I will feather my mask after the fact. That gives me much greater control over what's going on. I will also then leave sample all layers checked and check auto enhance, and auto enhance kind of smooths out that selection that I'm about to make. This process goes really fast. There are a couple things that I tend to do that most people may not think about, so I'm going to highlight those as well. When I make a selection, I don't want to select on this upper darker layer because there's typically not enough contrast going on here with the darker exposure for the sky. So it may screw up the selection right from the beginning and have me start it again. So what I do is I turn off that upper dark layer, and I'm going to come down to my lower layer here and select that as my operating layer. And I'm going to make my selection on this layer. And the reason for doing that is you can see that I have a lot of contrast. My sky is completely blown out, and that is actually good to make this selection as quickly as possible. We're gonna just start in this upper left-hand corner, and I'm just gonna start dragging in the direction that I wanna make a selection. And once I do that, you can see Photoshop has automatically selected all of this white area of my sky on the left-hand side of this pinion trunk. So now if I come over to the right side, I'm gonna do the same exact thing, and what happens? Photoshop joins the two selections because I have the plus option selected for my tool. So Photoshop has automatically selected a good part of our sky. It hasn't selected two little areas that are here in between the tree trunks because they are enclosed from the rest of my selection area. So I'm just going to come in here with the tool and click once and click twice just to get that selection. And I'm going to come into this bigger area and click as well and highlight that selection area. Once I have the selection made, we need to go back to our layers palette and turn on the upper layer again. And then also click that layer to make that our active layer. And the reason we're doing this is the upper dark layer, like I said before, is where we want to create the layer mask from. Once I have the selection pretty close to what I want, I'm going to come over to this upper layer, and in my layers palette down at the bottom, I have the option to add a layer mask right here, and I'm going to click that. And once I do that, it automatically generates a mask based on my selection. So as you can see here, our mask is hiding all of the darker areas of this upper image, and in doing so, it's allowing the lower image to shine through. If I turn off this upper layer, you can see that the lower layer is completely intact. If I turn on the upper layer, then it is only highlighting the sky area of this upper image. And the reason for that is I have masked out the lower area via my selection. In Photoshop, there's a rule we kind of follow with layer masks, and it's white reveals and black conceals. Now, don't get confused with the fact that our mask is not concealing our lower layer, because our mask is not on this lower layer. Our mask is on the upper layer. We are in fact concealing that area of our upper layer, which then allows this lower layer to shine through. I think the easiest way to think about it is wherever there's black in an image, we've turned off the lights, and wherever there's white in an image, our lights are on. We haven't turned off the lights in any part of the lower image. We've just turned off the lights in a specific area of the upper image. In doing so, that has allowed us to see what is below. We're controlling what's seen and not seen in the image by creating this layer mask. So kind of a neat little tool here. So one of the other keys to layer masks is that it is non-destructive. If I turn off or delete that mask, my original image is still in this file completely intact. And in fact, unless I flatten this image, that mask goes nowhere and those two image files stay completely the way they are. From here, we need to refine this mask so that the two images look realistic and don't look like we've just plunked one on top of the other. If I zoom into my image, you can see that my mask has some pretty rough and ragged edges here. And in order to adjust what's going on in this image, I'm going to come to the Properties palette and do some tweaking on this mask, not on the original image. So one thing I need to verify before I open my Properties palette is I need to verify that my mask here is selected. If my mask is not selected, you can see that the brackets surround the main image. Once I click on the mask, you can see that the brackets surround the mask, telling me that that is what is active in my layers palette right now. I have the Properties palette in my workspace. My workspace is customized for me. If you do not see the Properties palette in your workspace, you can easily just go up here to Window and scroll down to Properties and click that, and that will open the Properties palette over here here in your workspace. Once we get this properties palette open, we have options available to us. You can see that it's highlighting that we have the layer mask selected, and we have density and feather are two kind of global options available to us immediately. Feather is a tool that allows us to smooth out the edges of our image, and if I use this global feather tool, you can see as I slide it from 0 and continuously get higher and higher, that I create not a smoothing effect to my mask, but at the same point I'm also creating a lot of haloing. Now the further I go, the better the blending on the feathering, the smoother it all looks, but you can see as I get higher and higher with my feather that my image begins to look exactly like I just dropped a graduated neutral density filter over the photograph in the field. And like I said from the beginning, this technique is the one that I'm using to eliminate this process. So adding feathering to our mask helps, but it also hurts us. So that we have to find a good balancing point between what's going on in our masks to give us an image that looks realistic to our viewers. I am going to actually add a little bit of global feathering in this option, 1.2 pixels. And if I zoom in on my image to show you that effect, you can see here how hard-edged my mask selection area is. If I just bring my global feathering up to 1.2 pixels, it's just smoothed out that edge just a tiny bit. Now, this is just kind of a basic starting point for me for this image. There are a couple other tools that we need to enact here to make this image work the way I truly want it to work. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to go down in my properties palette to the refine area. And under this refine area, we have mask edge, color range, and invert. I'm going to click the mask edge option, and that brings up another dialog box to me. When this tool opens, you can see I have what looks like to be a brush available to me. And in fact, it is a sort of brush for the refine mask palette. It is the refine radius tool. What this tool allows me to do is paint around edges of masks and refine those edges quickly and easily, very similar to the way a brush would work. We haven't touched anything in this palette yet, and we are going to, but the first thing I want to do is brush around the edges of the mask that I created. And you can see here as I brush, I'm drawing black on my mask, but this black is not what's being painted on my mask. It's just an area of highlight to show me where I'm painting. For the first time user of this technique, you would think that this is completely wrong in what it's doing. It is adding more haloing to my layer mask. This is not necessarily the look I'm going to keep for the end of the image. I'm going to continue on brushing around here because what this tool is allowing me to do is pick up all of the edges along my layer mask to make everything very even. So as I run around this tree trunk with the refine radius tools, it's going to select the areas of my mask that it thinks it needs to smooth out. It's going to make the entire mask fairly even along the edge. It's also including the super dark areas and the super light areas that my quick selection did not really get. So we don't have to go crazy with our selection tool in this process because we can come in here with the refine radius tool and just paint along our edges to smooth everything out. Now, as I draw along my image edges, you can see that they are haloing out a little bit, but at the same point, they're all haloing to the same level. And that's what we want. We want an even haloing effect because we can control that here with the refine mask palette once we get done painting across this. So I'm just going to finish up painting across the image here. Get those edges all kind of blended in the same way, then zoom back out. Once I have that, you can see that my outline is turned a lot lighter with a little finer edge of haloing around this pinion trunk. In order to fix that, we're going to come in here to the slider area of the refine mask. Again, I'm going to zoom in, go through each and every one of these options to see which one works best for me. Now, I've predetermined what's going on with this image and how I can make this mask look the best as possible. In doing so, I realized that checking the Smart Radius Edge Detection option, pushing that radius to 2 pixels has smoothed out my mask by quite a bit. So if I show you the original by checking this Show Original option up at the top of my mask palette, you can see where we started and where we are now. Now, looking at the edges of our mask from the original selection, you're probably thinking that this looks better than what I have right now. And in fact, it probably does, but the new area of the mask is, like I said, even and uniform across the entire area of this pinion, and that's what I want from the start. So we turned on Smart Radius, we've turned on the radius as well, and we brought that up to 2 pixels. The only other piece that I need to adjust here is the edge. The Shift Edge tool is going to allow us to change the direction of the mask. So it's either going to add more to the mask or move more from the mask. So on the minus side, it's pulling the mask back away from our selection area. And by pushing the Shift Edge to the positive side, it's in fact bringing that mask in from the area in which I originally selected. So bringing my Shift Edge to about plus 50 smooths out all of those halos that you were seeing along the edge. And we'll just click Show Original here. It looks even better now than it did before. So we started by painting around our mask with the Refine Radius tool to even out the entire mask. Then we came in here, turned on Smart Radius, and added 2 pixels to that radius option. And then we shifted the edge of our mask to plus 50. Now if we zoom out, that's a pretty good looking mask edge in comparison to where we started. Everything is pretty uniform. So we've refined this mask to a pretty strong degree that our 2 images are already starting to blend together. But we're not done here. I'm gonna take and apply this refined mask adjustment that we've just made to our image. And then we're gonna come back here into the layers palette, still keeping our layer mask selected. And one cool thing about layer masks that most people don't realize is that they function very similar to having a black and white image attached to our original image. By knowing that, that means you can come in here and create adjustments on your layer mask, just the same way that you could create adjustments onto an original image. I have decided that I'm going to adjust the brightness and contrast of this mask to get the blending between the 2 images a little bit smoother than it is right now. I'm going to check the Use Legacy box, and what this does is it kind of smooths out the highlights and shadow clips areas of the mask. I've just found that it makes it a little bit smoother of a transition when using this technique on a layer mask. Okay, so the way this brightness and contrast adjustment is going to work on our layer mask is just opposite of the way it works on an image. Your intuition is going to tell you that adding brightness to a mask is going to brighten the image, but it actually is not, because what it's doing is it's brightening the mask, bringing the mask closer to white, so it is actually allowing more of that image, that upper image, to be seen. Now if we drag it to the negative side, it's going to create more darkness in our mask, and that is going to allow more of the image that's underneath to show through, thus the image is going to look brighter. So what I want to do with this tool is just a very simple minor adjustment. If I bring my brightness to 11, and I'll show you here the difference between it in the preview and unpreview, you can see it just feathers that mask just a little bit more to make it blend and be a little bit more believable than the point at which we started. Okay, so once I've applied this brightness and contrast adjustment to my layer mask, there's one other thing I want to do to the mask to allow this to look even a bit more believable than it does right now. As you can see in my overall image, there are some areas that are just a touch brighter in this tree that make it look less contrasty and less believable to the viewer. And in order to fix those, I'm actually going to come in here using a manual method of painting on my mask with my brush tool. If I hit the letter D for defaults, it's going to change my color palette from whatever it is to white over black. I can switch these 2 colors by just hitting the X key, and you can see over here that the colors are flipping back and forth. D for defaults puts white on top and black on the bottom, and that's going to be our starting point typically for whenever we use this brush tool. Okay, so up here in the brush palette, I have a couple options available to me. I am going to turn the opacity of this brush down to 10%. And what that means is whatever color I'm painting, white or black, it's only going to paint 10% of that value. I can go over my brush strokes multiple times without putting 100% of that color into my layer mask. So I can build the areas of paint up so that I'm truly controlling what is seen and what's not seen. And we can pick a good middle ground to make this mask blend even more. Now, as we start, we're going to paint white over the mask. And by doing that, you can see that I'm darkening this tree ever so slightly. What that does is it's allowing me to make this tree look a little bit more believable as we look up into the sky towards the sunset here. I keep painting over my tree trunk everywhere. I think I need a little bit more feathering to my mask, and I'm using a very wide brush. We're at 900 pixels and the brush hardness is set to 0, so we have maximum feathering to what we're doing. And I just come in here and paint in over the mask with white, and that's allowing me to hide just a little bit of this overall harsh selection that we created originally. And you can see if I go into my histories palette and I go back to my last technique and go back to my brushes, you can see how I've made that tree blend even a little bit more. Now, if we come to the conclusion that where we've painted has gone a little too far, that's where the X key comes in to flip our black and white colors. And now we can paint black onto our image. And what that does is it removes what we've just painted. So we have the option of essentially erasing our mistakes here in this layer mask. Zooming in, there are some areas down along the bottom here where we've got really, really dark mountains that were part of our selection. And in order to change that, what we want to do is, with the black still selected and 10%, I'm just going to come in here and paint to lighten those mountains. And this is just creating a gray area kind of at my mask boundaries. In doing so, makes the blending again even that much more believable. And I just go back and forth switching between white and black until I get a good blending area to my mask. Once I've got that all completed, I think we'll have an image that looks much more believable than when we are now. So we take all of these hard edges out. So now scrolling around at 100%, close my layers palette here so you can see more. You can see how all of our halos are pretty much gone. We have a lot of detail in our tree trunk, yet it still looks completely believable overall in this image. Once I've completed this task here, I will save this file as it is with the layers intact. So if I need to come back here and make further adjustments or refinements to this layer mask, I can do that. Then I flatten everything and create a separate file that allows me to come in and specifically do my targeted adjustments to this composition the way I would in any other photograph. Here's the final layers image that I've created, and here is the final image with all of the adjustment layers that I have done to make the image look final. And you can see it's got a lot more contrast, it's a lot more believable, and I don't think anybody would really be able to tell that I've taken two separate exposures and blended them together. So I hope this was informative, and I hope this helps you in the future for solving some of the issues you might encounter in the field when you're taking photographs. Thanks very much. This is Jay Goodrich, and this was exposure blending in Adobe Photoshop CS6. Thanks very much.